Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 596. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Today, joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well. Happy to have you back on. A lot to talk about on today's show. Just to remind people to share the show, hosted at the Libertarian Institute, reposted on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. Let's get into it today. Connor, the article I wrote for the Institute over the weekend. And part of the reason I wrote this article, Connor, is because this doctor, Adam Hamaway, who is credited with saving Senator Tammy Duckworth's life in Iraq, her helicopter was hit and went down. She's, I believe, a double amputee, and him with other doctors and a lot of other medical professionals and just fellow soldiers, I'm sure, are responsible for making sure she got to where she needed to get alive and everything. But this guy apparently did a lot of work on her after she was, injured in that helicopter crash. And so I saw these articles, Connor, titled the doctor who saved Tammy Duckworth's life in Iraq, now she's fighting to save his. And this seemed really odd to me because he is in Gaza and the Israeli army is dropping bombs on him. And the reason, Connor, that he would be killed is because of Israel's actions in Gaza. And yet Tammy Duckworth is a pretty hardened Israel supporter. And so I was very concerned about how she could be working to save his life. And I kind of put together that she's not, and that this is just a really sick piece of propaganda. So I wrote up this piece for antiwar.com because I thought it was really important to get the voice of the doctors out there since it's being distorted so much in the mainstream press. So the article I wrote for antiwar.com is American doctors stranded in Gaza ask for the U.S. to end support for genocide. So American doctors stranded in Gaza are seeking for the U.S. to cut off arms shipments to Israel. The physicians described a horrific scene of mass suffering in Rafah caused by the Israeli offensive in the city. President Biden has promised to cut off shipments of some arms to Israel if Israeli forces attack Rafah, a city that has served as a refuge for over 1 million displaced Palestinians. Speaking with the Washington Post, Dr. Adam Hamaway compared the suffering in Gaza to other war zones, but said now the victims are children. He said, I think of the injuries that you see in war with blood everywhere, with shrapnel that's supposed to kill soldiers and military personnel and take out tanks and bunkers. Now that is going through a child's body. So Illinois Representative Al-Banasser Rashid, who was serving as a representative for the doctors to the federal government, said the doctors want to see the end of the support for the U.S., the Israeli genocide in Gaza. He said, we're doing both things, trying to make sure our government is pushing for basic protection of aid workers and, more globally, trying to stop our government from funding the ongoing genocide in Gaza. The state legislature has communicated with Illinois Senators Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth. Duckworth claims that she is shaking every tree to ensure the safe passage of the doctors, and some U.S. outlets have credited Duckworth for working to save Hamaway's life. However, Duckworth voted in favor of a recent $17 billion aid package for Israel, saying it would help Israel eliminate the threat posed by Hamas. Now, two ways, Connor, Israel is directly responsible for this doctor suffering is, of course, Israel took the border crossing with Rafah. And so there's about 20 American doctors that were on, I think, two separate relief missions in Gaza, and he's a part of one of them. And as he was scheduled to rotate out, Israel took the Rafah border crossing, making it impossible for him and his team to leave. And so now the doctors are stuck there, and the doctors bring their own food, protein bars, in with them, Connor, and so that has now depleted with the lack of water and other food. Their health care is suffering, and so in that way they're in trouble. But additionally, the reason they can't just now drive a car out of Gaza is because of Israel. There was a UN car that was traveling in Gaza that was meant to help the doctors get out, and the Israelis fired on it and killed one Indian worker for the United Nations. And so we've seen here that this is pretty much all on Israel in trying to portray helping these doctors while sending military aid to Israel is just absolutely sick that our media is doing this. So Hamaway told the Post he believes American politicians need to witness the results of the destruction wreaked by American made weapons in Gaza. He described working on multiple children with severe burns and amputations within a few hours. Hamaway said he recovered the fragments of an American made Lockheed Martin munition at the home of a medical student. Muhammad Sabha, a second American doctor stranded in Gaza, wrote in the LA Times the physicians were shocked by the cruelty of the Israeli actions. He warned that cutting off the Rafah crossing has only blocked the flow of aid, but new aid workers to replace those rotating out. And so he's saying that, the problem isn't just that we're not able to get out, but once we get out, nobody is there to replace us. And so this means that the few doctors that are helping to maintain the medical facilities in Gaza won't be replaced, and then more people will die. Additionally, Connor, from my understanding, a lot of the very important medical aid that's getting into Gaza is coming in the luggage of these doctors. And so rather than bringing clothes, shoes, things to make themselves comfortable, the doctors are packing a suitcase full of protein bars, and that's what they're eating while they're in Gaza just to stay alive. And then with the rest of their luggage, they're bringing all kinds of other medical equipment. And so it's important to rotate these doctors in and out because you're bringing in important medical equipment, more gauze, just all kinds of sterile stuff, new equipment with these doctors. And so not being able to rotate them out is causing other problems. He explained that Israeli forces in Rafah, force hospitals in Rafah to evacuate, as the IDF has in other regions of Gaza. It will be a death sentence for those who have amputations and serious burns. He said, if the hospital were abandoned or their families forced to evacuate, I have no clue how these patients would survive, especially those with amputations restricting their movements. I can imagine the patients saying a final goodbye to their loved ones. And he's saying there, you're going to have a child, like a 9-year-old child with no legs, sitting on a bed, and his mother is going to have to choose to either follow the Israeli evacuation orders or be killed at the hospital. And so, he's saying that these are the harrowing scenes going on at this hospital. He also said that, at this point in time, there's not a whole lot of Palestinian medical staff left. And so the international doctors are coming in, they're running these hospitals, and I'm sure there's Palestinians there as well. But the lack of medical staff means a lot of these families are having to do the care for their loved ones, right? And so if you have a child or a parent even, and they have intensive burns, it's not a doctor, it's not a nurse who's providing the daily treatment for that, helping them get up and go to the bathroom. It's their family members doing that. So I mean, that has to be an incredible hardship to go through on its own. I mean, a lot of these procedures are very difficult to do, I'm sure, just for a doctor in a normal circumstance. But we're talking about here, these are going to be like wound care done without anesthetics, without the proper antibacterials. I mean, to see that on your loved one has to be absolutely horrific. So, I feel absolutely awful for these people and what they're trying to go through here. And so, Connor, I just wrap up the article here by saying, while Biden said he would end U.S. arms shipments to Israel if Tel Aviv launched an assault on Rafah, nearly 2 weeks into the operations, Washington has failed to act. On Thursday, Israeli forces pushed into central Rafah with satellite imagery showing widespread destruction. And they said, Connor, First, they said Israel shouldn't attack Rafah, and then they said Israel shouldn't attack Rafah without presenting the Americans with a plan for what they're going to do with the civilians. And Connor, that they didn't present the Americans with a plan for what they're going to do with the civilians. The attack went underway. They then said, well, Israel can't attack population centers, but I think 500,000 Palestinians now have fled Rafah. And so what are they doing, and how is this not an attack on a population center? So it just shows how weak the Biden administration's red lines are. All right, Connor, with that, I'm going to hand it over to you. I know you got a bunch of updates for us here.
Absolutely. So this story is about David McBride, the Afghanistan war whistleblower, who's just been sentenced to almost 6 years in prison. And this is really part and parcel with the efforts by the U.S. and its allies to criminalize whistleblowing and dissent against the war machine, especially as we ramp up here in the new Cold War against China and Russia, and of course carry out the genocide in Gaza and the rest of our efforts to, I guess, crush any sort of near peer competitors, but also any restive populations that haven't been subsumed yet by the empire. And so this is going to create a huge chilling effect, but it's important to stay on top of this, just like the Julian Assange case or anything else. So I covered this story that was originally written by Joe Laurie at Consortium News here for the Libertarian Institute. This is from May 15th. Military whistleblower McBride sentenced to nearly 6 years in prison. So Australia's David McBride, the 60-year-old ex-military lawyer turned Afghanistan war whistleblower, was sentenced to almost 6 years in prison by a federal judge in Canberra on Tuesday. Consortium News report. So although McBride argues he was fulfilling his obligation to his country, leaking documents to the media uncovering atrocities committed against civilians by Australian military personnel in Afghanistan, the judge made clear the harsh sentence is intended to deter any future whistleblowers or similar disclosures. Mark Davis, an attorney for McBride, as well as his solicitor, told Consortium News that this is a, quote, pretty vicious judgment, describing it as an extremely heavy sentence, especially since Canberra had admitted that McBride caused no harm and did not benefit personally as a result of the public disclosures. He said, "We are horrified, frankly. Whatever happened today, we are appealing." So Supreme Court Justice David Massop gave his ruling Tuesday morning, claiming only a prison sentence is appropriate. McBride is going to be in prison for 5 years and 8 months with no chance of parole until he has served at least 2 years and 3 months. At the sentencing, after accusing McBride of believing he was wiser than the Australian Defence Forces, Massop insisted to the court, quote, "It is imperative that others be generally deterred from holding such attitudes." McBride was charged with theft of government documents and providing them to journalists at the Australia Broadcasting Corporation. The documents exposed that unarmed Afghan civilians had been murdered by Australian troops on numerous occasions. A government inquiry, which lasted 4 years, in fact, found 23 potential war crimes, including the slaughter of 39 Afghan civilians, farmers, and prisoners. So Davis has explained that the defense will not only appeal the severity of the sentence, but also the conditions of the trial, which forced McBride's team into a corner before they pled guilty. So the public interest defense, which McBride and his legal team had intended to rest their case on, was rejected by Mossab back in November. McBride's argument included that his oath to the British Crown requires him, as a matter of duty, to inform the Australian public of its government's crimes instead of obeying military orders blindly and safeguarding official secrets. So as Consortium News' Joe Laurie notes, quote, his lawyers also invoked the Nuremberg principles in which it is a soldier's duty to break an oath to report serious crimes. So last November, Mossab ruled that this defense and ruled out this defense and declared, quote, there is no aspect of duty that allows the accused to act in the public interest contrary to a lawful order. An effort to appeal this decision was launched by McBride's legal team, but Supreme Court Chief Justice Lucy McCallum denied their application. So as Laurie explains, on the same day in November, Mossab ordered that agents of the Attorney General's office could remove classified documents from the defense's possession, which McBride's team had intended to present to the jury. But because of these regressive rulings, McBride accepted his attorney's advice that left with no viable defense, he should plead guilty. So outside the courthouse after Tuesday's sentencing this week, Davis explained, quote, it's an issue of international importance that a Western nation has such a narrow definition of duty. We say David McBride fulfilled his duty and he wished to put it to a jury that he conducted himself according to the oath he gave to his nation. So McBride's legal team pushed for leniency, pointing to his post-traumatic stress disorder and his belief that he was doing the honorable thing by informing the public of the reality of its government's military actions overseas. The prosecution instead accused McBride of being motivated by personal vindication and claimed he imperiled national security. Mossab denounced the defendant, proclaiming, quote, he showed no remorse. The defense lawyers were steadfast in their arguments that there was no evidence that anybody was harmed as a result of the disclosures and that McBride ensured any risks were minimized by handing the documents to professional journalists. So according to the BBC, the information McBride provided underpinned a series of reports in 2017 called the Afghan Files, which gave unprecedented insight into the operations of Australia's elite special forces in Afghanistan and contained allegations of war crimes. The Afghan Files lay bare numerous instances of unarmed men and children slain by Australia's special forces, including, quote, a 6-year-old boy who was allegedly shot in his sleep in 2013. So McBride earned his law degree at Oxford University and rose to the rank of captain in the British Army. He did 2 tours of Afghanistan from 2011 to 2013 as a legal officer with the ADF when he came to realize that, quote, a line had been crossed by the commanders. So during the next few years, while working in an army base located near Canberra and coping with his PTSD, that's when McBride began copying the sensitive documents over the period of about a year and a half. And McBride made repeated attempts to resolve the issue within the government before reaching out to the ABC. And I quote from a BBC report here, he tried an internal complaint first. When that failed, he went to the police and the defense minister before turning to the press. So he believed the dossier he compiled would show the ADF's chain of command was so concerned about the perception of unlawful killings that they were scapegoating soldiers and undermining special forces' confidence to do their work. And so Mossab quoted McBride as saying, "I never said I would cover up crimes for the government," which actually, I mean, it really says something about the culture in the inside the U.S. and its vassal states that, you know, a statement like that is obviously beyond the pale. So the judge said McBride he accessed the material and stored it in a personal folder, adding, quote, he then removed this information, some 237 documents, 209 which were classified secret, and took them home. Australia's federal police, quote, seized the documents from his home, giving rise to the charge of theft, Mossab continued. And Laurie reports the judge said McBride's lawyers argued his motivation was neither financial gain, though, nor to aid Australia's enemies, and that he believed he was not committing an offense. Mossab said McBride admitted to taking the documents, but in pursuit of a legal aim within the Protective Disclosure Act that McBride claimed he had a legal obligation to disclose. So Mossab's ruling has caused an uproar in Australia, with rights advocates condemning the lack of whistleblower protections in Australia and highlighting the fact that McBride has been imprisoned despite the reality that those whose potential war crimes he exposed have yet to be convicted or sentenced themselves. So Human Rights Watch's Australia director, Daniela Gavshon, said, quote, it is a stain on Australia's reputation that some of its soldiers have been accused of war crimes in Afghanistan, and yet the first person convicted in relation to these crimes is a whistleblower, not the abusers. She added, McBride's jail sentence reinforces that whistleblowers are not protected by Australian law. It will create a chilling effect on those taking risks to push for transparency and accountability, cornerstones of democracy. And really, I mean, the federal judge stated that is exactly the intention behind the ruling. So that's very disturbing, and we will definitely keep track of, what his legal team's next steps are, what the appeal process is going to look like. But this is just another devastating blow for whistleblowing and free speech and the free press within the collective West, as it's referred to by our ruling class. And really, again, shows, as so many stories we see every day and every week now, that, everybody already knew all the stuff about human rights and democracy and this sort of flowery liberal interventionist rhetoric that especially the Biden administration, the Obama administration are very heavy on, is just such transparent nonsense and just lies. It's very akin, and we're going to get into more attacks on the press here at the hands of the Israelis, of course, and it just, again, like the totalitarian sort of system Zelensky has built up in the wake of the Russian invasion and the NATO proxy war, criminalizing or banning, outlawing his opposition parties, nationalizing the media, persecuting churches. This is the kind of thing that if it was if the shoe was on the other foot and this was one of the designated enemies of the American empire, we would never hear the end of it, and it would be used to justify military intervention or at least sanctions. And but of course, when we and our allies do it, it's a-okay. Or in the case of the McBride ruling, I haven't really seen yet the U.S. government make any kind of a statement against it, even just to say, hey, we support this, or let alone to condemn it. Obviously, we've seen attacks on the International Criminal Court, sanctions issued against the ICC for attempting to even investigate American war crimes in Afghanistan. And we know from the Cost of War project that just looking at the bigger picture of this, you've got about well over 200,000 people that were killed, at least in that war between Afghanistan and Pakistan over those 20 years. And so there's and we know from previous releases from WikiLeaks and other groups that there's just been scores of war crimes committed just by the American forces there. Many of which are cataloged in Fool's Errand by Scott Horton, the one of the best books, if not the definitive take on the war in Afghanistan. And so it's just, absolutely shameful to see what's happened to not only Chelsea Manning, but also Julian Assange and Edward Snowden and Daniel Hale and now David McBride. This is really kind of the death of Western values, if those even really exist anymore, and really just shows there's no end to the hypocrisy of the American ruling class and the Blinkens of the world, and what they're able to, the kind of war crimes and atrocities they're able to commit, and then just, basically continue with business as usual. And, it's absolutely reprehensible. And so we'll stay up to date on this story and see what the next moves are by the legal team. Okay, so this next story is about, well, this came out of the Associated Press, and this is about, well, they're covering the aftermath of this pogrom that was carried out by Israeli settlers against the village of Duma in the West Bank back in April. And so I covered this for antiwar.com on May 10th. So a rampage led by illegal settlers against the village of Duma last month has left a, quote, trail of wreckage, including approximately $1.3 million in damage, epitomizing the dire situation for Palestinians within all the Israeli-occupied territories during the Gaza war. So the leaders of the Duma community told the AP that the Israeli army, the IDF, arrived shortly after the 3-hour attack erupted, but hardly intervened to stop the mayhem, apart from shooting at Palestinians attempting to repulse the settlers as homes and cars were set ablaze. According to the UN, this pogrom was just one of nearly 800 settler attacks launched against Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank since Israel's war on Gaza was launched last year. The head of the Duma Village Council told the AP that at least 15 homes were damaged by arsonists and 6 villagers were wounded by Israeli gunfire. The trail of destruction left along Duma's main road, quote, highlights the village's limited resources to clean up and rebuild, let alone defend itself from future incursions, which seem inevitable. Duma is no stranger to extreme settler violence. In 2015, Amriam Ben Uliel firebombed a Palestinian home, killing 3 members of a family, including an 18-month-old baby, and severely burned a 4-year-old child. This latest assault was ancillary to a series of settler and IDF attacks, which have included some ethnic cleansing carried out after the dead body of a 14-year-old Israeli settler boy was found in the illegal West Bank outpost of Malachi HaShalom, an area Palestinians are barred from entering. The IDF blamed his death on a, quote, terrorist attack without evidence at the time, although an arrest was made days later of a man from the Duma village. Israeli security forces claim the 21-year-old man linked himself to the attack. That really does not mean anything, and I don't trust anything coming out of the Israeli occupation forces as far as this. Who knows? This is probably just so I don't, again, they haven't, so far I haven't seen any evidence presented to show that this guy is responsible for the death of this settler boy. It looks like a way to, who knows what happened to the 14-year-old Israeli settler that was found dead, but again, linked himself to the attack. I mean, the Israeli army often has children sign confessions written in Hebrew that they can't read. And obviously, we've covered on the show numerous times people that are detained by the Israeli army under Israeli occupation are routinely subjected to torture. So this is, you know, and so, as Al Jazeera reported last month, quote, since the boy's body was found, the army has supported Israeli settlers as they attack Palestinian villages, injuring and expelling many. Now, Yesh Din, an Israeli human rights group, which I believe was the first Israeli human rights group to designate the system to formally characterize the Israeli occupation as an apartheid state. And so they accuse the IDF of facilitating these pogroms by protecting the violent settlers with what they call an umbrella of security. As Ziv Stahl, the director of Yesh Din, explains, quote, as soon as the Palestinians try to protect themselves, they're the ones who the army attacks. So Douma is geographically vulnerable. The AP notes it overlooks Jordan and settlements to the east, but it's surrounded by 3 steadily expanding illegal outposts. And Douma falls under Area B of the West Bank, where the PA, the Palestinian Authority, manages civil affairs, but the Israeli occupation army runs security. So the PA is backed and trained by Tel Aviv, London, and Washington, and rarely opposes Israel's military operations. So soon after the war began, following settlers' kidnappings of multiple members of the force, the PA's armed unit, which previously patrolled some of these areas at night, was shut down. Quote, over the past year, settlers have cut off Douma's access to 4 vital springs and wells that surround the village by sabotaging roads and other infrastructure, residents told the AP. Since October 7th, more than 100 Bedouin Arabs who had been enjoying their nomadic lifestyle, been living in the pastures of the south of Douma, where they were forced to move out to the outskirts of the area after settlers began stealing their livestock and torching their tents. Yesh Din reports that the Bedouin Arabs living outside Douma are one of 16 such communities displaced by settler violence during the war. Ibrahim Dawa Ashba, a Douma resident whose sole source of income, his truck, was destroyed by settlers during the attack. It was burned, beyond, it can't even be repaired. Was asked by the outlet what his fellow villagers can do to defend themselves from these mob assaults looking forward. And he said, what preparations? There are no preparations, he answered. Dwashba added that most of his family hid in his kitchen while settlers were burning parts of his home with fire bombs. And the health ministry based in Ramallah says that almost 500 Palestinians have been killed and thousands more have been injured in the West Bank since the October 7th Hamas attack. Most of the Palestinians murdered have been gunned down by the IDF. According to UNICEF, last year was the deadliest year on record for Palestinian children. So this just goes to show, once again, all of this is sort of ancillary to the overall ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinians that's taking place, primarily in Gaza right now. But as you can see, what they're doing is they're making, that we already saw early on after the war began. There was that important story that came out in 972 Mag discussing how rural areas outside of Hebron were being systematically depopulated, these village communities. And it's happening more and more. And the deaths, the murders of Palestinian, men, women, and children have skyrocketed in the West Bank since October 7th. They were already skyrocketing in 2023. Nearly 200 Palestinians have been killed in East Jerusalem and the West Bank before October 7th. So, and that was one of the deadliest years on record. And so now it's completely soaring, the violence and the attacks against the Palestinians, and they are being ethnically cleansed. Obviously not nearly at the rate of what we're seeing in Gaza. As Kyle mentioned a moment ago, you have about 500,000 people being displaced internally within Gaza from Rafah, which was their only refuge from the massive bombing across the whole strip. And there's really no place for them to go. But what is that? I mean, when as Sullivan says, we haven't seen the attacks on population centers yet, or when you have, administration officials making comments like that, of course that's what this is. And it's happening in the West Bank as well. And so this next story is from Al Jazeera. covering the more on the what's going on in the West Bank. Israelis killing Palestinians in cold blood in the occupied West Bank. This is from May 13th. Again, from Al Jazeera. So on October 19th, Sarah Mahamid watched helplessly from a window as Israeli security forces shot her younger brother. Taha, 15, had been playing with a friend outside their house in the occupied, or excuse me, on October 19th, Sarah Mahamid watched helplessly from a window as Israeli security forces shot her younger brother. Taha, who was 15, had been playing with a friend outside their house in the occupied West Bank city of Tulkarem. The 19-year-old screamed as her brother fell to the ground. Their father, Ibrahim, ran out the front door to get his son, but a sniper shot him too. Sarah told Al Jazeera, I remember hearing my father shout that Taha might be alive, but I knew that Taha was martyred. I knew he was dead. Taha was killed instantly. Ibrahim fought for his life for 5 months in intensive care until he also died. Footage seen by Al Jazeera shows Taha and Ibrahim were both unarmed and posed no threat. My other brother ran after my father out the door to stop him. He saw that Taha was dead, and he saw my father get shot. It seemed like steam or smoke was rising from my father's body as the bullets hit him. Nearly 1,500 Palestinians have been unlawfully killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank in the past 16 years. 98% of them civilians, according to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Each of them, like Taha and Ibrahim, have a story, and the loved ones who mourn them. The frequency of the killings have spiked in recent years, with Israel killing 509 Palestinians in 2023. That is more than double the number recorded by OSHA in any previous year. So in the first 3 months of this year, we've seen 131 Palestinians killed, a higher rate of killing than the previous year, according to Human Rights Watch. So Omar Shakir, the Israeli-Palestine director at HRW, said, Israel has a decades-long pattern of using lethal force against Palestinians, but it seems the Israeli government is taking steps even further in that regard. Israel says its operations in the West Bank are necessary for security reasons. It cites the same justification for its assault on the Gaza Strip, which has killed 35,000 Palestinians in response to the October 7th Hamas-led attacks on Israel, which killed 1,139 people. The killings in the West Bank are carried out during home raids or during stops and harassment at Israeli checkpoints. Some Palestinian children have even been killed on their way to school, according to Human Rights Watch. The Israelis are firing at people who don't pose an imminent threat to life. They are also firing at people who are fleeing and at people who are injured and laying on the ground. Some of these trends have existed before, but it appears these incidents are happening more frequently, Shakir told Al Jazeera. So Israeli officials have for years backed a shoot-to-kill policy, regardless of whether the Palestinians being shot pose a threat. Israel has even authorized its army to shoot at stone throwers and has handed out assault rifles to Israeli Jews living in illegal settlements in the West Bank. And that's a direct reference to National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. Settlers killed 17-year-old Omar Abdelghani Hamid when they attacked his village in the West Bank on April 13th. Omar was one of several young men who had confronted the settlers to stop them from beating up Palestinians and attacking their homes. Omar's father, Ahmed, and said his son and his friends scared the settlers away, even though they were not carrying weapons. However, one of the settlers returned with a pistol and shot Omar. Ahmed said the bullet went through the right side of his head and out the left. He died immediately. Thank God he didn't suffer much pain. Ahmad learned about Omar's death via a WhatsApp group that all the villagers used to notify each other of settler attacks. Later that morning, his son was pronounced dead at a hospital. So Ahmed said he is searching for justice, but Jewish Israelis are almost never held accountable by the Israeli authorities. From 2017 to 2021, less than 1% of all legal complaints that Palestinians filed against Israeli soldiers, including for extrajudicial killings, led to prosecutions. Less than 1%. And this is from the Israeli human rights group Yesh Din. And in that time, only 3 Israeli soldiers were convicted of killing Palestinians and were given lenient sentences. Others were ordered to complete, quote, military community service for killing Palestinians, according to Yesh Din. So Shakir from Human Rights Watch says there is a culture where Israeli units know they can carry out grave abuses without being held accountable for their abuses. Army raids and extrajudicial killings are part of a broader attempt to keep Palestinians in the West Bank afraid, says Zaid Shubai, an analyst and activist with the Palestinian rights group Al-Haq. But it has ultimately led to the formation of a new generation of armed groups, often established by young people who are fed up with the occupation's transgressions. Israel's response to this new wave of resistance has been to target entire communities to crush the morale of Palestinians. And we saw that virtually as soon as Netanyahu came to power in December of 2022, most notably before October 7th with the huge raid on the Jenin refugee camp. Well, really at the beginning of the year in 2023, but there was a bigger one in July, where they tore up the water and the electricity and the roads and sent in like 150 armored personnel carriers, 1,000 troops, Apache helicopters, drones, and carried out airstrikes in the West Bank for the first time since the Second Intifada. And it's only escalated since then, and they've been doing the same thing to other refugee camps and other villages, of course, and towns. And so, he says, they want to reshape the Palestinian mind into thinking that we shouldn't even dare to resist, and if we do, we will have to pay a high price. This is about intimidating us. They want to put us down and to colonize our minds. Sarah believes that this was the purpose behind the Israeli attack on her family, where they killed her brother and her father. She said that while her father and her brother bled to death on the street, Israeli soldiers entered her house. The Israeli army then cut off the water and the electricity to their home. So at one point, one of the Israeli soldiers began beating up her other brother with the butt of his rifle, telling him to shut up and keep silent. Moments before the soldiers left, Sarah mustered up the courage to ask why they terrorized her family. He said, "To scare you," Sarah told Al Jazeera. She said, "I couldn't believe it. I wonder what was wrong with them. They killed my brother and my father just to scare me." So again, this is what's going on in the occupied West Bank. The story I always think of that comes to mind, one of the first indications I saw that there was going to be open season on Palestinians in the West Bank concurrent with this genocide in Gaza, before it was even clear that it was really a genocide in Gaza, although there were obviously indications. This was after or around the same time that Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, came out and announced a complete siege and described all Palestinians in Gaza, including more than 1 million children, as human animals, and said he was going to deliberately deprive them of water, fuel, food, medicine, all the necessities of life in the midst of a massive bombing campaign on civilian infrastructure and residential areas. There was a murder of 3 Palestinian olive farmers in the West Bank, and then there was a funeral procession held the following day, and the Israeli settlers showed up who had killed the same, settlers had killed the 3 olive farmers. The next day they hold a funeral procession, and a father and a son are murdered together by settlers at the funeral procession. It's just shocking levels of violence and ethnic, hatred, and it's this. Like I said, this is a murderous society. There's something very, very wrong with what's going on, obviously in the West Bank, and particularly among the settler community, emboldened by the right-wing coalition with Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, and Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister. Of course, this is around the time they're also starting to hand out the assault rifles to settlers, and bringing more of these guys into, the IDF. We covered a bunch of stories about pogroms going on throughout the West Bank, where it's really difficult, especially early on, for people Palestinians who are being brutalized in their homes to determine, are we being attacked by the IDF right now, or these settlers? Because they started wearing these IDF uniforms and it wasn't really clear, but they've been bringing in more and more of these ultra-Orthodox extremist settlers into these IDF, I guess they call them like civil protection teams. And a lot of these guys they can even bring in people who have prior criminal records. This is just very dangerous. And it's important that Al Jazeera covers these stories coming out of the West Bank. It's one of the best resources for information in the occupied territories and what's going on, along with Electronic Intifada, Mondo Weiss, and several other Arabic outlets. But This next story is very alarming. So Israel's this is from Middle East Eye from May 15th. So Israel's Gallant reportedly orders Al Jazeera closure in the West Bank. And so this is what I'm getting at with further attacks on the free press by the U.S. and its allies. So Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has reportedly ordered his army chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, to block Al Jazeera from broadcasting in the occupied West Bank. Quoting unnamed sources in the Israeli military, Israel's army radio reported that the army was working to implement Gallant's order against the Qatari broadcaster. So, according to the Times of Israel, it's not clear whether the order would apply to areas of the West Bank where Israeli settlers live or if it would extend to the Palestinian areas as well, where Al Jazeera is widely watched. It is also not clear if the order would mean the closure of Al Jazeera's offices in Ramallah, as well as a block on the network being watched across the West Bank. An Israeli army spokesperson told the Times of Israel the IDF is working to implement the defense minister's order, but the military did not confirm what the order was, and Gallant's office has not released an official statement. Al Jazeera has not responded officially either. The reported move against the broadcaster is just the latest in a long campaign against it. On May 5th, the Israeli government voted to shut down Al Jazeera's operations in Israel. The broadcaster is one of the last remaining international media networks reporting from war-ravaged Gaza. Al Jazeera previously broadcast live from Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and just outside Gaza in northern Israel daily. It has since been forced to produce all of its coverage from Ramallah. At the time of its closure in Israel, Shlomo Kari, the Israeli communications minister, just joined Ben-Gvir in a march calling for the resettlement of a legal resettlement of the Gaza Strip, said in a statement that the government signed orders to immediately close Al Jazeera's offices in Israel, confiscate broadcast equipment, cut the channel off from cable and satellite companies, and block its websites. Following a cabinet vote on the closure, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed Al Jazeera reporters had harmed Israel's security and incited against soldiers, and referred to the outlet as a Hamas mouthpiece. Neither Netanyahu nor the Ministry of Communications provided examples of Al Jazeera content they claim pose a threat, which is very characteristic of the Israeli government. Al Jazeera decried the decision and said the accusation that it threatened Israeli security was a dangerous and ridiculous lie and part of Israel's ongoing suppression of the free press. So it'll be very interesting to see, how they move forward on this, what the U.S. response will be, how they're going to try and spin it, this naked attack on journalism under the apartheid rule of the Israeli military in the West Bank. And I wonder if they're going to prevent Al Jazeera, or what they can do to prevent Al Jazeera from even reporting to the rest of us what's going on in the West Bank. They've already, Israel's already killed several Al Jazeera journalists and their family members as well. More than 100 journalists have been killed in Gaza since the war began. And so this is really unprecedented. But, you won't hear about this the next time Tony Blinken or some U.S. ambassador to somewhere puts out some tweet about how much they care about journalism, and you won't hear about this at the White House Correspondents' Dinner or whatever. This is, absolutely infuriating. And of course, just like after the 9/11 and we go into the whole war on terror era, we look to Israel for, almost for advice. It was after the 9/11 attacks, almost like for advice. Like that's what Netanyahu came when to explain to Congress when he was pushing for war on Iraq, regime change in Iraq. Of course, the Americans, you guys do it. And then saying, and then next you'll take Iran, right? But one of the things he was, he comes there with this air of authority, and says that Israel knows how to handle terrorism. But we adopted so much of the Israeli sort of, we started acting like Israelis, becoming synonymous with torture, in particular to extract false confessions from people, treating people as enemy combatants. All these things. I mean, just the becoming more and more of a national security state, the juicing ourselves up culturally on hatred of Muslims. So this is very dangerous. Of course, we're seeing with similarly with the ban on TikTok, again at the behest of the Israel lobby to protect our client state as it commits a genocide of a civilian population, a defenseless civilian population. some of the poorest people in the world. And of course, it's indefensible, so they're going to have to continue to do things like this to crush, um, any sort of alternative media source that can get people the truth. And so this is very alarming, and we'll stay on top of it, see what happens next for Al Jazeera in the West Bank. Now, this next story is from Jason Ditz, who's, as always, keeping us all up to date on the war between, well, the burgeoning war between Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon. So this is from May 17th. Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon kill 3, including 2 children. So Israeli forces targeted a series of infrastructure, in quotes, sites in southern Lebanon today, going after compounds belonging to Hezbollah's aerial defense system on the grounds that they pose a threat to Israeli aircraft. The strikes hit the villages of Narajdia and Odysee, both just south of the coastal city of Sidon. This is just over 18 miles from the Israeli border, which is deeper than most strikes in the South Lebanon area. So Hezbollah identified one of its fighters as slain during the attacks without detailing the exact circumstances or his role in the organization. The strike also killed 2 civilians, both identified as Syrian children. While presented as terrorist infrastructure, the targets included a lot of buildings. It's unclear which were Hezbollah and which were not. The strikes were reported to have hit a pickup truck in an orchard. In general, in previous strikes, civilian homes turn out to be what's meant by infrastructure. Hezbollah responded to the deaths by firing some 75 projectiles at the Kerem Ben Zamara and the Tonsbar logistical base in the occupied Golan Heights. One missile strike in Kerem Ben Zamra was reported to have wounded 2 Israelis, though details are not yet available. The attacks came just a day after the drone strike against the town of Kana hit a vehicle near a funeral procession, killing 2 people, one of whom was identified as linked to Hezbollah by rescuers on the scene. And Kyle covered this story at the end of the previous show, but I just had it here again from Jason on the 16th. Israeli drone strike kills 2 near South Lebanon funeral procession. So they fired on this car near a funeral procession for Hussein Ibrahim Maki, a Hezbollah commander who was killed earlier in the week, and the drone strike killed at least 2 people. Again, it's just, can you imagine what the mainstream media reaction would be if Hamas or whoever or Hezbollah was attacking IDF funeral processions in Israel? But this is the kind of thing, again, that we just totally accept. Just like Israel can bomb Lebanon and claim they're fighting, they're targeting Hamas infrastructure, and yet they're hitting orchards and killing Syrian children. And it's not, again, this is just, we've always been at war with Hezbollah. We've always been at war with South Lebanon. You, me, Joe Biden, Benjamin Netanyahu. It's very alarming how close we are to a multi-front war here in the region. Things seem to have simmered down for the moment with Iran, but of course Israel is ramping up its bombings of Syria again. And, this is always a powder keg, what's going on now since October 7th between Hezbollah and Israel, and it's not going to stop until the war in Gaza is over, the siege has been lifted, and the Palestinian people are, at this point, it might be until the Palestinian people are free, but certainly not until there's a ceasefire and the siege is lifted and aid is allowed in unimpeded. And of course, we hear from Israeli officials all the time that they're not going to negotiate a ceasefire, even if it means the hostages will be further imperiled. They're going to take Rafah, and as things escalate and spiral out of control in Rafah, and we may see tens of thousands more people slaughtered here in just the next month or two, there's always the risk for a radical escalation between Hezbollah and the Israelis at that point. And that would definitely, or I should say almost certainly involve in greater involvement by the Iranians and the rest of the axis of resistance. And that means U.S. troops are going to start to be targeted a lot more in Iraq and Syria and Jordan. Obviously, we've already seen some American soldiers killed as a result of the White House's unconditional backing of Israel's genocide in Gaza. And we're, again, just dragged into a massive war that could dwarf the consequences of all these 20 plus years of the terror wars, and see it's just going to be an absolute devastating situation. We still have an opportunity to get out of it, but of course, the Biden administration, the Trump administration, either way, it looks like we're going to have full-throated support for Israel, whatever Netanyahu wants, and we're going to together help, ethnically cleanse Gaza and remove the Palestinians from there, which is never going, that's going to really risk or damage American national security. I mean, the biggest lie in town right now is that this does anything to benefit the safety of Americans here or abroad. And we still have yet to really learn the lessons of 9/11 and blowback, as Ron Paul has always talked about. So this is very dangerous, but we'll stay on top of it and see, what happens next this week. I assume it won't be any good news.
Yeah, in fact, Connor, just right now, there's reports that the helicopter, and this is from the Iranian government, that the helicopter that was carrying the president, Raisi, has had what they're describing as a hard landing. No report yet on what that means. It's being discussed in the kind of, at Twitter universe as Raisi is likely dead, but who knows what that actually so be careful about the reports you read until you read something official. And also, while a lot of people are going to be claiming that they know for sure that this was either an accident, some kind of hit by the Ayatollah against the president, or a Mossad hit against the Iranian leader, examine evidence, discuss evidence, but don't say, oh, this was a coup, or this was a crash, until you actually have some time to look into it. All right, that's where we'll wrap up the show for today. I'm guessing that will be a topic of discussion on the shows later in this week, but tomorrow Misty Winston returns to the show to discuss what the UK court decides in the morning about Julian Assange. So thanks everyone for tuning in. More later this week.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Kyle.